As a follow-up to my prior video, what makes a 4-star good? What makes a 5-star bad? With the release of characters like Xianyun and Gaming, I kind of want to go over this. This is a follow-up to my what makes a character a must-pull video, so if you haven't watched that, go watch it. It will be linked down below and shown on screen in the top right. But we have such a wide variety of characters. I have a vast majority of them, sure, but I don't have all of them. I've skipped characters like Novelette, I've skipped characters like Child. Even going into the character archive here, I've skipped a fair few. Whilst I do have all the 4-stars, with Cognosphere being the last one who took me about a year to obtain, even though I had C2 Ride and everybody else before her, she took the longest to get. I've tested out a fair bit of them. And yeah, I haven't built up ones like Sucrose because I hate Sucrose. But that aside, I legitimately believe that we've kind of had this weird up and down phase, at least in regards to 4-stars. If we're sorting them by ascension phase, essentially meaning whether they're 4-stars or 5-stars, we have a lot of options. But for me, I kind of want to focus on the fact that even though we have so many 5-stars, if you have a 5-star character, you're very likely to still use them. And the separation and differentiation between a good and bad 5-star is essentially down to what are they supposed to do. An example is very simple. Yoimiya, Wu Tao, Klee, Diluc are all pyro DPSs. This means that since they all occupy the same role, if one unit performs better than the other, the previous unit is thereby benched. Usually because you are essentially pulling this unit, not just because you like the design, or maybe their story, but also because you want them to deal damage on your team. If you have a Yoimiya and a Hu Tao, with equal levels of investment, your Hu Tao will perform better. This doesn't necessarily mean Yoimiya is bad though, this just means that in her role, she isn't the best option, and that's perfectly fine. You can have a average or mid character and still have fun with them. But why is it that we have certain characters who are just viewed as outright bad, or certain characters who are just viewed as not worthwhile to invest into? Whereas with 4-stars, the investment level is much lower simply because they take less resources to get going. They take less experience books, they take less Mora. And so as a result, they should be, theoretically at least, easier to get going. But I don't see many people talking about the 4-stars as much. You have the 5-star characters who, if you love your Ito, you still use them. If you love your Tignata, you still use them, your Nilo, and so on. If you love characters like Eula, or Mona, or Tartaglia, you will find ways to use them. Dragon Strike Diluc is still a thing. And I think that exemplifies what I think a lot of people like about 5-stars, is once you get one you love, you legitimately will invest into them. I love Ganyu. She's one of my most heavily invested characters. She is triple crown. I got her skin, I got her weapon, and I still use that character despite her not necessarily being the most meta. But with 4-stars, you don't necessarily see that same amount of adoration. Yes, you can love Sayu, you can think she's cute, you can think she's hot, it doesn't matter. You can love a character like Jin Yan, you can love a Cognosphere, a Yanfei, but you don't necessarily see the same appreciation, dedication, or discussion regarding their value. I think we've gotten to the point in Genshin Impact where we kind of are in this position where if a 4-star comes out and they're bad, we're just like, yeah, it's another 4-star, you know, can't expect much of them, and we move on. And I don't think that necessarily is fair, but I also want to talk about why certain characters are viewed badly. An example being, people disregard Kale, Dory, Mika, Faruzan, Layla, and Candice. These are just prime examples here. And we do have some standout ones. Yaya is a standout 4-star. Kuki Shinobu is a standout 4-star. Somewhat, and I'm gonna get back to this, bad though. So what happened? Everyone, including Sucrose and beforehand, is a launch 4-star. The staples being Bennett, Bisho, Xingqiu, Xiangling. And even though Sucrose is a staple, we do have other replacements for her now, so it does kind of depend on what you want to use her for, but regardless, she's a staple and a good 4-star character. After launch though, Diona was essentially the only character that was essentially good. She was paired alongside Jin Yan in her initial banner, and these three all came out relatively soon and relatively recently connected to one another, with Rosaria being on the Child banner. If you watch Slice's summons, you know how badly that went for some. But Diona was a great character because she's a shielder. She was paired on the exact same banner as a unit who essentially occupied a similar role, that being Zhongli. She's a downgrade to Zhongli in the shielding department, but has more utility in the healing department. She doesn't offer resistant shred like he does, but she has other utilities. That's perfectly fine. What this means is that if you got a Diona and you invested into her, whether you thought she was cute, whether you thought she was funny, whether you enjoyed her personality, it doesn't matter, she at least held some value for your account. You may not use her now, but she was at least decent back then. Jin Yan was a dud. We can all admit that. I don't think it needs to be delved into as to why people don't use her. She has split scaling. Is she a physical DPS? Is she a pirate DPS? Does she want attack? Does she want defense? Who knows? Who really cares? Because a lot of us have written her off, especially with that EN voice acting. But Rosaria, Yanfei, and Sayu all respectively did well in their roles. Sayu being a downgrade to Jean, Yanfei essentially being like Klee, but a little bit less clunky. So after that, we had Sarah, Toma, and Gore. Sarah is a character who, in my opinion, is a awful example of a buffer for a specific element, because she doesn't buff that specific element, she buffs one character, that character being, yes, Raiden Shogun, a good character, and yes, a character who she's attached to in the lore and story, but it doesn't necessarily change the fact that as the electro buffer, she doesn't perform super well for her whole element. A Kujosara can buff Raiden pretty well, but Yaimiko doesn't necessarily have the snapshotting that characters like Fischl do. So as a result, Kujosara's buff wears off for Ya. It wears off for characters like Sino, who require so much on-field time. And so it really only means that she can buff Raiden effectively because she's not necessarily buffing everybody to the maximum potential. If you snapshot it with Fischl, then yeah, Sara is great for Fischl until you resummon Oz, in which case the buff is gone. Thoma. I think Thoma is still a bad example, or a bad character. I don't like Thoma, personally. But if I'm talking about the gameplay and the overall style of him and Kuki Shinobu, you can be like, and understand, I understand perfectly fine if you think Kuki and Thoma are good. They're good now. They weren't good then. And I don't think it's fair to then retroactively say this character's always been amazing. Kuki Shinobu was god-awful before Denjo. Because she, yes, was a healer, but she didn't do anything exceptionally different from any other healer, and she was more risky to play. Now, that risk is rewarded. Now you build elemental mastery into Kuki Shinobu, and you get rewarded for it, because she lies and essentially works with Aggravate, Hyper Bloom, and so on. But before that, Kuki Shinobu was just a bad healer. She did her job okay, but when you're compared and stacked against Viridescent Venerer, Sayu, and Jean, and a Bennett buff, you're not exactly doing your job. Even Barber's Revive had more utility than that. Eizo, perfectly fine. But what about Goro? What about Yoon Jin? Well, Yoon Jin, the problem with Yoon Jin in particular is that she's too niche. You don't really have many characters who want to normal attack. You have a character such as Yoimiya and maybe Scaramouche, but beyond that, you don't really have anyone else who cares too much. With Claymore characters, you can hypothetically say it works, but Claymore characters have hit lag, and so her buffs don't matter as much. Goro is a fine character, except for the fact that he buffs defense. See, if Goro's entire damage buff was based around geo damage, I think he'd be perfectly fine. But buffing defense in a geo-specific roster sounds fine on paper until you realize that Ningguang wants attack, Zhongli wants attack and or HP, and as a result, he's only buffing Albedo and Ito and not everybody else, and he doesn't really deal damage himself, so it's not really worthwhile, and Navia wants attack as well. Goro's biggest issue wasn't necessarily what he did, it's the fact that his element is so misaligned with one another that his buffs don't really pay off for any of them other than two specific characters who aren't really meta nowadays. Heizo, I think he's fine. Kale, her boomerang kinda is a bit iffy, and the Dendro application on it isn't necessarily that good or consistent, which is why a lot of people went just straight for Nahida as a prime example. I like Dory. She's cute. She has great art, but that aside, people don't like her. And I think this comes from the fact that, yeah, she's already in an element that is so good. If you're looking for any other Electro character, even if we are singling out only Electro-oriented units, the roster is stacked against her. Every other Electro unit offers something that Dory either can and does have, but worse variations of, or they offer something that she doesn't have altogether and is better for. Dory is, in my opinion at least, the worst Electro unit. She offers the utility of somebody like Diona, or maybe even characters such as Kuki Shinobu, but they are a lot more Constellation bound than other. Kuki Shinobu at C0 is a fine healer. At C2, she has 100% uptime. Kujosara is a great generalized buffer. Fischl and Raiden both offer wonderful energy recharge for your entire team and decent damage. Yaimiko, decent off-field damage. Beidou, decent off-field and AoE damage. Razor has its own energy recharge built into his kit and offers decent physical or electro damage. Lisa offers defense, shred, and off-field damage. Sino offers great aggravate and quick bloom damage when he's on field. And Keqing either has her electro-oriented build or her physical-oriented build with decent damage. Dory's attempting to offer energy recharge, but worse than the other two electro characters, an element based around energy recharge and healing, but not good enough to be worthwhile for the vast majority of you to use, especially given that she has a high energy cost for her burst and low energy generation for herself. So what are we trying to get at here? Because I know we've been rambling on. 4 stars, in order to be perceived as good by the community, either have to have one of two things. If they're a DPS, they either have to actually have good damage and ease of use. Furami had decent damage, but he was more niche because not a lot of people utilize Shatter, and if you were utilizing Shatter, you arguably would have just utilized Freeze in a much more safe orientation, or just utilized Xingqiu and Yelan in a better vape team. Charlotte was forgotten about, unfortunately. Chevreuse offered something unique, and so she's new, I won't necessarily go over her. But what about about the support scene? Well, to be a good buffer for your element, you actually have to buff that element itself, and not a specific stat that may or may not be used by that element. Farazan is good, she just has energy regen problem, but she's still good enough as an Anemo buffer. This essentially means if you're going to be a 4-star DPS, you have to have either a fun playstyle that's unique and easy to use, or you have to have good damage. Gaming has both. If you're going to be a buffer, ease of use and accessibility has to be a primary thing for you. Kujosara has ease of use, but accessibility isn't necessarily on par with anyone else because she only buffs Raiden effectively. If you want to last long, you either have to be extremely good and easy to use with certain reactions. Kushinobu and Yao Yao do incentivize this a lot because they both work wonderfully with dendro-oriented reactions, or you have to be a jack of all trades that performs wonderfully. Sayu is a great VV shredder and healer. She's also good for mobility and transportation. Diona is a good shielder, a good healer, can utilize melt for proper setups, and can raise elemental mastery at C6, and Bennett is a fine buffer. The failures in that respective roster were Dory, who had more energy regeneration issues and was higher and harder to invest into compared to her respective competitors. Goro didn't buff his element effectively enough to last long. The same thing applied to Mika in physical reactions and carries. Either. Originally, this video was supposed to go over 5 stars and 4 stars, but as you can see, we didn't really discuss 5 stars. So the 5-star video will be released on Friday. Subscribe if you're interested in that. I didn't want to make this video too long, just in case any of you weren't interested in watching all of that. Tell me your thoughts down below on the 4 stars mentioned and on what makes a 4-star good to you. Either way, hope you enjoyed. Subscribe to this channel and the second channel, which will be linked down below, and I'll see you next time.